are we a safe space for people to express their doubts, their questions, their reservations? Or are we the type of space that someone asking those things or admitting those questions would cause them to feel alienated and isolated and alone? How do we deal with moral failures that people experience? How do we deal with the questions of doubt and just those type of things? I think that it's really important for us to ask the question, am I a safe space?
Well, we're back for another session and day 2. This is one of our final sessions with my dear friend Rasool Berry. I'm excited to have him with us. You've seen him. He was on the Through Eyes of Color conference, and he was with me answering questions for Why Don't Go DC edition. So I'm thankful to have you. Welcome, Rasool.
Well, thank you so much for having me. So glad to be here with you, Lisa.
Yes, glad to have you. One of the reasons I wanted to bring Rasool back, especially for this session, because he participated on Why I Don't Go, but also he's a pastor. And I think for this to be a pastors and leaders conference, we need to hear pastors speaking into this space, especially the Why I Don't Go space. And we titled this Why They Don't Come. And this is meant for me and Rasool to give kind of a debrief from our Why I Don't Go DC. So, Rasool, tell our audience, what was your experience at Why Don't Go, and why do you think what you learned there was beneficial for you as a pastor?
Yeah, I was so grateful to be a part of that conversation and really listening to the stories and the perspectives of the panelists who chose to be there. And I think one, it was just really inspiring and really encouraging for me to see a group of people who used to go to church, who know that are familiar with that culture, familiar with those that approach, many of whom have experienced church hurt, to actually put themselves in a position where on the record they're going to say, this is why I stopped going, this is why I'm in a different place, and to do so in a way in which they were very gracious. I would say they were not angry and and vengeful, but they were very thoughtful about their experience, about the shortcomings, and I think that we live in a time, especially in the last couple years, where for the first time, really in like modern history, that there was a legitimate reason for nobody to be going to church, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that used to be like, oh, I should be going. And there are people who for decades had a rhythm, that was completely thrown off. And that gave them opportunities to really re-examine their choices, their commitments, and to help them see, I don't have to be here. And so I think unsurprisingly, we see in that same period that Pew's research comes out for the first time in 2020 that there are more Americans that don't go to church than that do go to church. And so I think in the midst of that moment, I think we're all in the middle of a reckoning to go, well, it's almost like, why do we go to church? You know what I mean? Not just why
Mm-hmm.
don't you come, but why do we still come? And I think it was really helpful to listen, to really lament with some of the stories that there were and the experiences that people had. But also, this amazing thing happened while we were there, that the very practice of the listening and engagement gave them new possibilities and opportunities to see, well, maybe there's something completely like that I didn't miss. Maybe I shouldn't completely move on, but still consider. And that was really fascinating and encouraging to see. So I'm grateful for the courage of the people, their honesty, and to have been able to be in the room and really answer some questions that were really thought provoking and challenging.
Yeah. One of the additional reasons that I thought you would be really helpful for Q&A is because you are in New York City, the crux of culture.
Yeah.
and you engage these kind of questions all the time, just being in the city, probably engaging people more than any other city, maybe LA more, but New York and LA, I feel like, are the cultural melting pots of the
Mm.
world, of the US specifically. And you're engaging a lot of people. So when you're engaging people on the street, on the train, you're always coming across different kinds of walks of life, different faiths.
Yeah.
I'm in the Bible Belt, so most people are still a little bit churchy. And
Yeah.
so, but when you're in those places in New York and LA, people are so far removed from church culture that it's almost like, what are you even talking about? You
Yeah.
almost have to reintroduce Jesus starting from the very beginning. And so, what maybe surprised you about the questions and engagement that happened there versus what you encounter every day in the NYC?
Yeah. Great question. And I would start, I mean, with kind of what I alluded to at the end of my initial comments, which was that here, just to echo what you were saying, in New York, it's a post-Christian society in many ways. Like literally, you go out and as opposed to being in the Midwest or the South where you say you're a pastor and they're like there's some just generic esteem and value. In New York, it's almost like what you do what like that's weird.
They're like,
That
why are
none
you
of
wasting your life?
exactly like huh and so I think from jump there's that. But the other thing though too that we don't want to miss in that, it's not just post-Christian, like there's nothing else, just there's a highly secularized culture. And the thing that's tricky about secularization is that it likes to pretend that it's not a thing. Like in other words, part of the philosophical sleight of hand, if you will, of our current cultural age is that it pretends like it's just objective reality with no presuppositions and no biases, right? And
Mhm.
so the view of looking at people who are of faith, whether that's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, is like they are doing something extra, but we're just being like normal, regular people. Like that's the and that idea and that point of view is more and more being shared across the globe and across the states as kind of the normal way of thinking about things. Like think about it. Like if you look at movies or shows like Handmaid's Tale or the Righteous Gemstones or all these different shows that kind of show these like just this like the scary thing is like the religious order of the day, and the way to free yourself from that is to be non-religious, right? Like that's a very particular way of looking at the world, and it's one that is dominant in New York and in LA and just like this aspect of culture. And so that reality is something that is different than what I experienced in talking to the folks, because that reality is a bit hostile to Christianity oftentimes, in particular, like, or to, you could say, definitive faith claims or objective truth claims. Those things are somewhat hostile to. What I found in talking to the group that we talk with was there was not hostility toward the framework of a way of looking at the world, a worldview that was Christ centered or that was God centered. That wasn't their beef. Their beef was with the trappings of just people being mistreating others or being legalistic or being judgmental, or the systems, or even just being in a place where they just had questions that just couldn't be answered. And so it was a different, so I was like surprised at how open folks were, because sometimes you see these stats like Barna or Pew Research and it's like all these people are leaving the church and they just hate it, and then you actually talk to these folks and you're like, no, there's not hate there. There's a decision to do something else with their time and their life in light of some things that happened and they brushed up against. But it really caused me to see that there was some hope, but also some real introspection that the church needed to figure out how do we pivot to become a better version of ourselves. Because the version of ourselves that we presented to the folks in that panel, they were actually attracted to, but it was just very different
Mhm.
than the version that they thought they had to sign up for in order to engage in this thing called church.
Hmm. So as I think about why I don't go, we don't want it just to be a Jude 3 thing that Jude 3 does. Obviously, we do the series, but I want it to be something churches do because I believe that the more why don't go conversations we have, the more retention we'll have in church.
Hmm.
And how can we create this space? And we could say, like, I could say, well, just do this. But obviously I'm not a pastor,
Yeah.
so I mean I'm a PK, but I understand that implementation in church culture is different. You can have an idea, but that idea has to flesh its way through church culture, through
Hmm.
personalities, through systems. All of those things have to be taken into consideration. So it's like, this is a cool idea, but what would it look like in a church context? What does it look like
Yeah.
for a church to create safe spaces and
Right.
not just, have a circle and say, hey, young people, what are your questions?
No.
Because that's
Yeah.
how people
No.
are thinking about it. But
Right.
what would be some things as a pastor you think would be good for churches to implement in light of
All
this?
right. I'm gonna try not to get too in the clouds. I'm a philosophically oriented dude, so I'm gonna try to make this simple. But I would start with us needing to examine our tone and our posture and our communication style as a church. And particularly, what I mean by that is, I guess, a simple question. Are we a safe space for people to express their doubts, their questions, their reservations? Or are we the type of space that someone asking those things or admitting those questions would cause them to feel alienated and isolated and alone? How do we deal with moral failures that people experience? How do we deal with the questions of doubt and just those type of things? And to me, that is both a theological question and it's a question about how we see ourselves in the realm of culture. What I mean by a theological question, there's a real, it fascinates me that Jesus was harder on religious people than he was with the sinners, quote unquote. And I think that there's a lesson in that, that the people who were, he said, woe to you who, make it difficult for people to come to a knowledge of God. Like, it'd be better for you that a millstone was tied around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. I mean, this harsh language about about what happened, what the judgment for leaders, religious leaders who make it difficult for people to come to faith. And I see a contrast between the grace and the empathy and the acceptance of Jesus and the harshness and the judgmentalness and the kind of type of rigidness that we tend to express as a church. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not one that's here to say loving people means accepting everything that they do or not having any standards or any of those things. We have to speak the truth in love. Like, Jesus was full of grace and truth. He told the woman that was caught in adultery, I don't condemn you, go and sin no more. Like, there was both things there. And yet at the same time, time and again in those conversations that we had revealed a certain experience that people had, a lesson that they were taught implicitly. It was never taught, here's a chapter, here the verse, but the way that they experience things was that, one, don't you dare question or express doubts, because if you do, you're going to be on the outside. Or two, like, don't you dare go out there into the world and be influenced by worldly ideas. We had a gentleman who talked about how his interest in sociology and social work and the social sciences caused them to say that you're studying the devil's, you know, stuff, and you're going to
Mhm.
be condemned for that, just for being in college. And that was what turned him away. And so I think that it's really important for us to ask the question, um, am I a safe space And part of that, just to be practical from a preaching standpoint, that means I need to model that on stage. Have I ever shared a challenging issue that may have caused doubt or may have caused wrestling? Have I affirmed the process or brought to light in the scripture how that posture that Jesus has to leave the 99 and go after the one, it should be modeled in us for us as leaders. Have I just embraced and affirmed people who have doubted? Those are some things that we can do. But in addition to that, I think that there's just the practical way of what we even offer as curriculum, going through things like reason, like Tim Keller has a great book, I think reason for God, or things like
Mhm.
that, where you can actually just invite and really literally just engage people with content around questions, through Eyes of Color curriculum, from Jude 3 is another great project or great product that can help with that. So I think that's where I would go practical, is like in our tone, in the way that what we emphasize up front. Are we modeling for people, this is a safe space where you can come with your doubts and come with your questions and come with your struggles and be supported in your process?
Yeah, and I think the point about tone I really really love, because I think pastors sometimes think that me sharing doubt or me sharing a weakness kind of makes people look down on me, or they want to create this space or this faulty sense that I have to have it all together.
Yeah.
And that's what makes moral failure even more hard for people to comprehend, or any kind of other failure or any doubt you may be wrestling with, when they hear it, because you set yourself up in a way that you
Mhm.
kind of aided the pedestal, like you kind of built the pedestal and stood on it, versus saying, hey, don't put me on the pedestal. Now
Mhm.
I'm watching over your soul, so there's accountability. I'm going to be judged harsher for what I preach, but I'm still a human being and I
Yeah.
still wrestle with things. I think that relatability helps with people feeling that they're not alone. Like when you share your stories of doubt, they're like, "Oh, okay. It's okay." Like
Yeah.
that's what made my professor so relatable to me when I came to him, my New Testament professor. I was telling him about struggling with the problem of evil, and innocent. Like I could understand older people experiencing evil, because you might say it's something they did, but when it's little kids, it's like, what did they do to deserve evil
Mhm.
that's done to them? And so he was like, instead of trying to give me this big philosophical answer, he just said, "Me too."
Yeah.
Like, and it was just like encouraging. That was half the battle, because it's like, okay, somebody who has a PhD in New Testament is still struggling with this, so
Mhm.
it's okay for me to struggle as a student. And I think that's something that people sometimes miss.
Yeah, and that's the power of the pulpit. So I just to give you a couple examples, um, I'm very thoughtful about these stories that I tell, the illustrations that I give, in that regard. Like for instance, mental health right now is a huge issue. It's an issue that the church has sometimes uh, made it difficult for people to get the type of help that they needed, whether that's psychological counseling or even medical, prescriptions. And so I make it a point to tell, at different points, to share an anecdote. Um, can you hear that?
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm sorry. That's I mean, I live in a Jewish neighborhood, so that's the alarm that the Sabbath is about to start. So that's the first one. That's like the 5-minute warning one. Then there's another one that happens. So in any case, so it's going to come back in a couple minutes. But um, the I make it a point to share about the fact that I experienced therapy, and I had a session today. It was really helpful. And I do that because I want to normalize, and I know that I have to kind of go extra step, because oftentimes people may assume that that's not a valued experience in the church, or that's something that they should be ashamed of. The other thing, we had, what's simple, man. Yo, the saints had it right back in the day. Testimony service. Let me bring it back to testimony service, because we had a year in, kind of end of the year testimony service on a Tuesday night, And let me tell you that, like, I forgot how powerful it is to just have the saints get on a mic. We screened ahead of time, so make sure that do some coaching so folks ain't going wild on the mic. But we just shared that we gave them opportunity to share their stories. And there was this one lady, she shared about how and so we screened this, so we heard this earlier in the week. But she talked about how she was really struggling in her faith before the pandemic, and but she just decided to make her way when we were able to open things back up again. And she said that while the people were worshiping, she was like, I didn't have the faith to lift my hands and to be able to be excited about the lyrics that we were singing, but I was leaning on the other people's faith. And I just thought that was such a
Mm.
beautiful picture that she said that. And people were just like, yo, I feel that. And the fact that she said that just did something for all of us. There was another young lady who, after she got baptized, ended up getting pregnant, was really, ashamed, was thinking about abortion, and met with the pastor. And because our lead pastor gave her just encouragement and said, we will, as a church, come alongside of you and help you. And she shared that story. And let me tell you, like, it was like there's not a dry eye in the house. And so I think it's important to create spaces where people can testify, can be affirmed in their stories, because what did Revelation say? They overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. So that's another thing that we can do to just implement. See, the saints, they do that 100 years ago, and we just forgot.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. And I love what you said about the pregnant young lady, and instead of offering condemnation, offering support.
Yeah.
And I think that church hasn't done a good job at that.
Right.
And so to hear y'all modeling that, I think is so vital, because, when you think about people saying, why I don't go, and then people telling their church stories online, church hurt stories, when they had moral failures or something like that, they received condemnation and not community help, where correction can be given, but also community
Yeah.
to come alongside the body. So I think that's so dope, and I think that's a good model for people, engaging people who fall into different things and different vices, to help, because that creates a safe space, right, where people
Yeah.
say, I come to the church for refuge
Yeah.
and not condemnation.
And let me tell
And
you,
so,
like, that young lady, she's been on fire ever since. Like, literally, the only way, because she had no family here in New York City, the only way that she would have been able to take care of this baby is if, like, we helped. And so, literally, my wife, other people took turns, doing what she, babysitting, doing things that she needed to do so she could work and get herself, get her on her feet. And now she's just sold out, like, just completely, like, and seen God work in a way, in this love that she's experienced as a mother has helped her to see God's love as like, there's just these incredible things. So when we lead with compassion and empathy, we see the floodgates open up to a degree that you could never imagine than if we lead with, like, judgment and criticism.
mhm. When we get to Q&A, um, what are some things you want pastors to keep in mind when they do Q&A that you think will be helpful
Whew.
for people to feel safe still,
Yes.
even in
Yeah.
that moment? Because I think
All
that's a
right. So here's
vulnerable
here's
moment.
another practical. I'm giving y'all a practical. Use a text in feature. Do not make people raise their hand and ask their question um, in front of everybody, because you will have a few brave souls that do that, but many will not, because that's an incredibly huge risk.
Mhm.
We did a sex and sexuality conversation where we did this feature. There's, like, different ones like Slido and other web-based products that you can use so that it has an interface, and you can text in, and you can just kind of scroll through. People can rate which question they want to have asked, and so you can actually, so they end up becoming the ones that help you curate your questions, because they're ranking the ones. You did that at in
Yeah,
Courageous Conversations, right?
yeah.
Which service did you use?
Pigeonhole.
Pigeonhole. There you go. So
Mhm.
that's another one. But the point is, there's two values with that. One, the anonymity of being able to ask a question kind of protects the person who's asking the question from feeling like, the judgment of those who may be around. So there's some power to the anonymity of, we don't know who asked this question, but we're going to answer it. Two,
Mhm.
like, especially if you use one of those services like Pigeonhole, where you can actually invite people to rank the question. So even if they're not there, some people just like to be in the comments, right? They don't want to say nothing. They just want to see what's around and just be like, and have their input. That allows you to do that. So that's a practical thing. But if you're not that tech savvy and you like, I don't know about none of that Pigeonhole, what that mean? You can just give somebody a text, a phone number and just say, hey, text in this number, and you just work that way. But I would really encourage that you use some type of anonymous method. You can use paper and pen, put it in a hat,
Mhm.
like an offering plate. It could be as low budget and low tech as it needs to be. But that would be the first thing. The second thing is, I would say, in the response, remember that you're modeling an entire approach to how to engage with people on these things. So I think you kind of do the encouragement sandwich. There's another practical thing. You start with, you know, something positive. Thank you for asking the question. It's a good question. You know what I mean? I'm grateful that you asked. Then give a response if something in the response deserves some type of pushback or whatever. And then you again finish it off with something positive, so that you're ultimately modeling for people that we value your questions, and that way we're modeling that is that when we get a question, we don't blast the person or make light of it or mock it, but we actually treat it with a sense of dignity that it deserves. And so those would be like some major things. Oh, and then lastly, like your professor, not every question needs an answer or deserves an
Mhm.
answer. This is something you see with Jesus all the time. Like, he didn't answer every question because it wasn't all coming from the same place. And as much as we want to encourage people to like be open, some people just want to cause trouble. Some people just want to, throw, some fly in the ointment, and they don't really care and want to know anything. And so I think you want to be wise and savvy, but also realize that I don't have to answer everything as directly as it needed. I can say, man, this is a complicated topic that I really wouldn't be able to do justice in a 2-minute response, but I will give you this as like a big
Mhm.
picture to say. Or you could say, hey, I wanted you to, answer. I mean, let me know, here's an email. You can ask, I'll, if you want me to know or want to hear my response, email me and I'll give you more detail. And then lastly, if you don't know the answer, say you don't know the answer. Don't try to
Yes.
fake it till you make it. Don't try to pretend, like, because that'll just, because see, right now we have, if there's 100 people in the church, there's 100 different fact checkers on their phones that are ready and willing to Google you and your answer. And if it ain't accurate, then that just hurts you and the credibility and maybe even their confidence in the faith. And so if you don't know, be like, that's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that one and research that, and I'll get back to you on that some other time.
Mhm.
So those would be my big takeaways for how to engage in a Q&A that's going to be encouraging, that's going to be helpful for people.
Yeah, I think that's great and vital, because no answer is better than the wrong answer.
Yeah.
Uh, and it also, I would add the Q&A. Maybe what we do for problematic passages, we ask people to submit questions beforehand so
Mm,
we can research those questions and then have some off the cuff. So when you have the no answers for the off the cuff, at least you had some answers for the pre-submitted. It gives you
yeah.
time. And when you tell people that's a good question, let me get back to you, get back to them.
Yeah.
I know a story of a young man in Richmond. He went to his pastor saying, I got these questions. He was being kind of approached by Hebrew Israelites. He went to his pastor, was like, good questions. Let me get back to you. Never got back to him. And now he's in Hebrew Israelism. And
Mm,
because he was like, if the pastor couldn't answer my questions, I had to go where the people had answers. And
right.
so we want to be mindful. We never know who people are getting approached by, if people are trying to pull them away. And so if they bring us a question, try best to
Oh,
research and get back to them.
let me throw another one in, because that what you just said
Mhm.
just reminded me of something. Especially on some thorny or like seemingly out of left field questions, it's sometimes really helpful. The best response you can have is a follow up question to ask why they're asking that question, right? Because there could be a million reasons why someone's saying, hey, are black people the original Israelites, right? Like, and it's like that could be a question, and you're like, why do you ask that question? Or like, what, where did that come from? Like, there's always some stakes, some people, some conversations happening before the question gets there. And it's just really helpful because, and it's helpful to be not asking the wrong, like sometimes someone is just curious because they saw something online. I don't know. I heard Kendrick Lamar's album and I was just curious. Sometimes it's like my brother is talking to me every day about this thing, and what do I do? And so, or it could be something altogether different. The problem of suffering could cause somebody. So I would just say also asking again, this is what Jesus did, um, sometimes when people ask them questions, he was like, so, when Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Like, who told you about that? Like, you ain't Jewish. Why you care about who the king of the Jews is? Where you get that from? And so those, sometimes asking the follow-up question before you get into your answer is also helpful.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful. So you will know, like you said, what the stakes are before you answer the question, and you'll take it that well, we always are taking questions seriously, but if the stakes are higher than usual, hey, I need to really devote some attention to this because this is a life or death situation for the person.
Yep.
Um, as we wrap up, this time has went by so fast, but as we wrap up this, why they don't come, what would be your admonishment or some words of wisdom that you would leave that you haven't already shared
Yeah.
that you learned from this experience that you want pastors to take away from?
Yeah. It was such an honor for me to be in that discussion and interact with these folks who, had, left and had no plans on coming back. And I think sometimes we live in a time period where there can be such a pessimism or a sense of just like we just taking L's all over the place, a real sense of low morale. And moments like that can cause you to think everybody hates the church, nobody wants to leave. Like, I was just me behind, like Elijah when he was like, God, I'm the only one left. And he's like, boy, there's 5,000, 7,000 people that haven't bowed their knees to Baal. Like, you ain't by yourself. Like, and I think that's sometimes that discouragement, it weighs heavy. And there was just this couple powerful things happen. One, the conversations kept going after the filming. The sense, like I said, you could tell, like they was like, what church do you go to? Like where can I, go? Like there was a sense of something awakened in them that said, wow, there are other options beyond what I was thinking. But a couple weeks later, one of the folks from the panel, Why I Don't Go to Church, came to our church in a different city. Like, it just happened to be there and came. We had dinner afterwards and just, broke bread together, and was just this incredible follow-up experience. And I was like, man, and it was because he saw something and experienced something in that whole process that, caused them to be like, you know what, I want to explore this more and dig a little deeper. And so, that really encouraged me. And I would say that to know that just whatever somebody is walking away or doubting or taking the season, not to make it as like this black and white, they hate everything and they're not coming back. Sometimes it's just like leaning into a conversation and finding the fact that there are people who really are hungry and thirsty and just need some guidance to get them to the bread of life and the living water.
Yeah, and I'm glad you shared that because pastors sometimes and people in the church leaders think, oh, this their frustrations, they don't need to be shared. They just don't want to be there because of sin or different things. That's sometimes the case. But what we saw is that these people were open, and as you said, like you felt like if we were there another hour, revival might have broke out. I remember you said that at the end, just because of the conversation that was happening, and you could see their hearts kind of turning even in the midst of that space. And so, don't allow people's putting their saying their frustrations about the church. Don't internalize that. Try to distance yourself from that because I think a lot of church people internalize and think, oh, they talking about me, and it's like no, they're talking about their experience. Don't internalize that.
Yeah.
And just like when you're talking to, white brothers and sisters, and you just like, when you start talking about racism, and sometimes white people get defensive, and you like, I'm not talking about you per se, I'm talking about my experience.
Yeah.
In that same way, some black church members can do that same thing to the church, in the church.
Yeah.
And so it's like, understand, you distance yourself from the criticism and allow people to speak, but don't internalize it. And then you can have a conversation that's fruitful.
Amen. That's absolutely right. I totally agree with that. Not to internalize it. And it allows you to pivot into a space where you can just listen and lead with empathy. I'm sorry you experienced that. Even if and do not lead with a defense of, well, I don't think the pastor meant that, and I think you misunderstood, or I don't think they meant to, because what that does is it causes someone to think, oh, you don't value my experience, right? And so I would just start with, always with, man, I'm sorry that you experienced that, and I could see how that would be really hard to hear and cause me, I would want to leave if I thought that was what was going on. And like, then you can start to ask a little bit more, about, like, what do you think that means about God, or what do you think that means about the people, or being able to offer, but don't try to defend people or the institution. God don't need your defense. Yeah, someone said, like, a lion doesn't need, someone, a defender. Just let it out the cage and do its thing. Like, the gospel is enough. It does its work by itself. And so, but yeah, then on the flip side, don't think that you need to defend the people at a church in order to defend the gospel, because those are two different things. And I think as long as we do that, we'll find that people will be more open to wanting to share with us the process and go, that one experience, that alone tells them that the one experience that I had is not the totality of experiences that people can have. Maybe it was something unique about that situation. And that says it more than it demonstrates it more than we could ever say it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Rasool. This has been a rich conversation. Y'all check out, if y'all haven't already, the Why Don't Go DC edition, and see how we navigated that space. And after you listen to this debrief, maybe you'll go back and re-listen to it again if you've already watched it, with fresh ears and lenses, to see a new, like, hey, like, this is a model that I can follow in my church. Thank you for listening to this session, Why They Don't Come.